Welcome to Deep Thinkers. Tonight, I'd like you to do something very simple. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day slide off them slowly, the way water slides off a leaf. There is nothing here that needs solving, nothing here that needs remembering. There is only a long, quiet story and a calm voice to carry you through it, and all the time in the world. We have, in fact, more time than you can possibly imagine. 4.5 billion years of it. And we are going to walk through all of it together, very slowly, while you drift towards sleep. So let me give you a way to hold a number that large, because 4.5 billion years is not a number the mind can really feel. You can say it, you can write it down, but you cannot picture it, not honestly, any more than you can picture every grain of sand on every shore. So we are going to play a gentle trick on time itself. We are going to take the entire history of the Earth, all 4.5 billion years of it, and we are going to pour it into a single day. One ordinary day, 24 hours long, from one midnight to the next. The kind of day you have lived 10,000 times without thinking. And we will let the whole life of the planet play out across those 24 hours, like a clock ticking softly on a wall in a dark room. So, midnight. The clock reads 12, all zeros. This is the beginning. The Earth forms out of dust and rock and fire, a young molten world with no oceans you would recognize and no sky you would want to breathe. That is our starting bell. 0 hours. And from there the day begins to turn. Now here is the first thing I want you to notice, and I want you to let it settle over you slowly, like a blanket. The morning is long and it is empty. The hours after midnight pass, 1, 2, 3, and there is nothing alive at all. The planet cools. Crust forms and breaks and forms again. Water gathers. And it is not until somewhere around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, in this single compressed day, that the very first life appears. And even then, it is nothing you could see. It is small beyond seeing. Single cells drifting in dark water. No eyes to look back at you. No bones, no leaves, no wings. Just the faintest beginning of the thing we call living, alone in a wide and quiet sea. And then listen, almost nothing happens for hours. I mean that with great affection. The middle of our compressed day, the long, bright stretch of morning into afternoon, all of it belongs to those tiny, invisible cells. They are the only show on Earth. Hour after hour, while the imaginary sun climbs toward noon and slides past it, the planet is a microbial world and nothing more. The whole great drama of biology that you might be expecting, the forests and the fish and the great lumbering beasts, none of it is here yet. The afternoon comes. Complex cells begin to appear, still microscopic, but more elaborate inside, and still no animals you could ever hope to see. It is not until very late in the day, around 9 o'clock in the evening, with the imaginary light long gone and the imaginary stars out, that the first creatures large enough to see with the naked eye finally arrive. 9 in the evening, out of a 24-hour day. Everything you would call an animal, everything with a visible body, crowds itself into the last few hours before midnight. Plants creep onto the land around 10 in the evening. The dinosaurs, those giants who seem to fill so much of the story we tell ourselves, rule only the late evening, and they are gone by about 20 minutes to midnight. The mammals spread out and grow large only in the final 20 minutes of the entire day. And us? Our own kind, human beings, every one of us who has ever lived. We arrive in roughly the last minute. And all of recorded human history, every city ever built, every word ever written, every name you have ever known, Every war and every song and every quiet kindness between people, all of it together occupies only the final fraction of a second before midnight. A single blink less. The whole human story is the last tick of the clock, the part you would miss entirely if you so much as turned your head. Let that be the shape we carry tonight, not a number, but a feeling. We are the very last second of a very long day, and the day was alive and busy and astonishing for almost all of its length, long before we were even a possibility. Which brings me to the one simple truth that this whole story really turns on. Here it is, plainly. For the first 7/8 of life's history on this planet, there were no animals at all. None. 7/8. Imagine cutting the whole story into 8 equal pieces and laying them out before you. 7 of those pieces, 7 of those 8 long stretches of time, contain not a single creature you could have seen, touched, or named. No fish, no insect, no worm crawling in soil because there was barely any soil, and certainly nothing to crawl, just cells and water and chemistry and patience and time. The history of life on Earth is overwhelmingly a story about the very small. We tend to tell it the other way around. We tell it as a parade of magnificent animals marching steadily toward us, as if the whole point of 4.5 billion years was to arrive, at last, at human beings. But that is a story we made up to flatter ourselves. The honest story, the real story, the one written in the rocks, is a microbial story. The great turning points were almost never the appearance of some splendid beast. They were quiet things, chemical things, a new way of catching energy from the sun, a change in the very air, a single cell swallowing another and, instead of eating it, keeping it. These are the events that mattered most, and we will get to every one of them slowly tonight. There is no hurry, there never was. Before we walk on into that long, dark morning of the world, let me ask you something, just softly, before you drift too far. Wherever you are tonight, in whatever quiet room, under whatever roof, in whatever corner of the world, I would like to imagine where that is. So if you feel like it, somewhere down below this, you might tell me where you are listening from tonight. A country, a city, the side of a hill. I read them, all of them, slowly, the way I would read a letter. And if you are new here, and you would like more of these long, calm journeys through deep and quiet things, you are welcome to subscribe and stay a while. There is no rush about that either. It will keep. Now, settle back. We are going to walk all the way through that single day from midnight to midnight, from the first cell to us. And the first thing we have to do before we meet any living thing at all is to learn how the day itself is divided, because the people who study these things did not simply pour the history of the Earth into one undivided stretch. They cut it into great chapters. The largest chapters of all are called eons, and there are 4 of them. 4 enormous blocks of time, each one with a name, each one with a story for why it begins exactly where it does. So let me name them for you gently, like the 4 watches of a very long night. The first is called the Hadean. The name comes from Hades, the old word for the underworld, the realm of fire and shadow beneath the earth. And that is exactly the right name for it, because the Hadean was a hellish time to be a planet. It runs from the very birth of the Earth, about 4.5 billion years ago, down to roughly 4 billion years ago. 500 million years of a world you would not survive for a single breath. Picture it, if your mind is still awake enough to picture anything. Oceans not of water, but of molten rock, glowing in the dark. Things falling out of the sky constantly, great chunks of debris left over from the building of the solar system, slamming into the surface again and again, melting it, breaking it, never letting it rest. There was no stable crust to stand on, even if there had been anything to do the standing. The whole young world was a furnace, cooling slowly, hammered from above, restless beneath. And here is the strange and lovely thing about the Hadean. We have almost nothing left of it. Almost no rocks survive from that time at all. The whole eon is defined in a way by its own absence. The crust that formed back then was destroyed, melted down, recycled into the churning interior of the planet again and again until hardly a trace remained. So when we say the Hadean ends and the next eon begins, we are very nearly saying this is where the rock record begins. This is where the Earth starts keeping its diary. Everything before it we have to infer from the few faint clues that survived. But, and this is the kind of detail that makes me love this story, a few clues did survive. The very oldest pieces of the Earth that we have ever found are not rocks at all, not whole ones. They are tiny crystals, crystals called zircons, no larger than grains of sand, almost impossibly tough, able to outlast the rocks that once held them. And in a place called the Jack Hills in Western Australia, geologists have found zircon crystals that date back about 4.4 billion years. 4.4 billion, that is older than nearly everything else on the surface of the planet. These little grains formed when the Earth was still young and terrible, and they have survived intact all the way to a scientist's hand. And here is what they whisper to us. Their chemistry hints that there was already liquid water on the Earth that early, surprisingly early, far earlier than we once dared to think. Even in the middle of the hellfire, it seems, there may already have been water. The first oceans, perhaps, gathering quietly between the impacts. The very first hint of the conditions that life would one day need. Held for 4.5 billion years inside a crystal smaller than a poppy seed. We will come back to those zircons later because they are not only a clue, they are a clock. But for now, let them rest. The Hadean ends around 4 billion years ago, and the second eon begins. This second eon is called the Archean. The name comes from an old word for beginning, for the ancient, for the origin of things. And it is well named because the Archean is where the Earth's continuous diary truly starts, and it is where life itself first appears in that diary. The Archean runs from about 4 billion years ago down to 2.5 billion years ago, a vast stretch, 1.5 billion years long. And the reason its boundary is drawn where it is, the reason geologists say here, this is where the Hadean ends and the Archean begins, is that this is roughly where a continuous record of surviving rock takes over from the near total silence before it. We are no longer guessing from a handful of crystals. Now the Earth begins to leave us proper pages to read, and on some of those earliest pages, faint but real, is the signature of the living. We find it in two ways. We find chemical traces, subtle imbalances in the makeup of ancient rocks that look very much like the fingerprints living things leave behind. And we find something more wonderful still. We find stromatolites. Now that is a long and strange word, so let me set it down beside something gentle. Imagine the layered structure of an onion, or the rings inside a tree, ring upon patient ring. A stromatolite is a mound, a rounded dome of rock, built up in fine layers, one thin sheet at a time, over years and years. And it was built by life, by mats of tiny microbes living in shallow water, trapping fine grains of sediment, growing a little, being buried a little, growing again, layer over layer over layer, until a small, stony hill of their making rose up from the seabed. They are among the oldest direct fossils of life we have ever found. The evidence from stromatolites and from those chemical fingerprints pushes the story of life back at least 3.5 billion years, with some contested whispers reaching back further still toward 3.7 or 3.8 billion years ago. So sit with that for a moment as you sink a little deeper. By the early part of the Archean, on a young and quieting world in shallow, warm seas, there was already life. Not life you could see. Single cells gathered in their mats, doing the slow, patient work of being alive, building their little stony domes one layer at a time, and they would have the planet almost entirely to themselves for a very, very long time to come. The Archean ends around 2.5 billion years ago, and here we come to the third eon, the longest of them all, and the one that almost everyone skips. It is called the Proterozoic. The name means roughly earlier life or former life, and the Proterozoic is enormous. It runs from 2.5 billion years ago all the way down to about 539 million years ago. That is nearly 2 billion years in a single aeon. It covers, all by itself, close to half of the entire history of the Earth. Half. And yet, if you think back to the histories of life you may have heard before, this is the part that gets passed over in a sentence, hurried through, treated as a long, boring hallway you walk down quickly on your way to the interesting rooms. Nearly half the story brushed aside. But the boundaries of the Proterozoic are drawn at two of the most important moments in the whole tale, and that is exactly why it deserves our patience. Its beginning is marked by the rise of oxygen, by a slow and world-changing transformation of the very air and the very seas, as a new kind of life began, for the first time, to fill the world with the gas we now breathe without a thought. We will linger on that transformation later because it is one of the great turning points and it deserves its own quiet hour. But know this for now, the Proterozoic opens with the coming of oxygen, and its end, almost 2 billion years later, is marked by the opposite kind of milestone. It closes at the moment when the first abundant complex animals finally appear in the record, the moment the world begins at last to fill with creatures large enough to see. So the whole vast Proterozoic is bracketed by these two thresholds. At its dawn, the breath of the world changes. At its dusk, the first large living things stir. And in between, across nearly 2 billion years, the Earth does its long, patient, invisible work, mostly out of sight, mostly very small. And then, at last, we cross into the fourth and final eon, the one we live in now, the one that holds every creature you have ever met. It is called the Phanerozoic. And that name is the loveliest of the four because it means visible life. Life you can see. The Phanerozoic begins about 539 million years ago and runs all the way to this very night, to the room you are lying in, to the breath you are taking right now. And the boundary that opens it was drawn at a very particular moment. It was drawn at the first appearance of abundant, hard-bodied fossils. The first creatures with shells, with hard parts, with bodies sturdy enough and large enough to leave clear, plentiful marks in the rock. Before this line, the record is faint and strange and microscopic. After this line, suddenly, the pages of the Earth's diary fill up with creatures you could hold in your hand. Here is a thought to drift on. Think of any great hall of natural history you have ever walked through or ever imagined. The towering skeleton of a dinosaur reaching toward the ceiling. The fossil fish pressed flat in slabs of stone. The first impressions of leaves and flowers, the bones of ancient mammals, the shells, the trilobites, the whole magnificent crowd of it. Every single one of those things belongs to the Phanerozoic. Every dinosaur, every fish you could name, every flower. All of them lived in this one most recent eon. The whole visible parade of life, the entire population of every museum on Earth, fits inside the last of our 4 great chapters. And that chapter, long as it feels to us, is only the final stretch of the day. Remember the clock. Visible animals only after 9 in the evening. The Phanerozoic is the last few hours. So now you can feel the shape of it. 4 eons, the Hadean, the world of fire, defined by what it left behind, which is almost nothing. The Archean, where the rock record steadies and the first faint life appears in its stony domes. The Proterozoic, the immense and overlooked middle, opened by the coming of oxygen and closed by the first complex creatures, holding within it nearly half of all time. And the Phanerozoic, the age of visible life, our own eon, the last few hours of the day, holding everything we usually mean when we say the history of life, though it is in truth only the closing act. And notice as you settle deeper into the dark what the boundaries between these eons were actually drawn upon. They were not drawn at the arrival of some glorious creature. There is no eon that begins because the first beautiful animal showed up. The line between the Hadean and the Archean is drawn where the rocks begin to survive. The line into the Proterozoic is drawn at a change in the chemistry of the air. The line into our own Phanerozoic is drawn at the first hard shells in the stone. 3 of these 4 enormous chapters, the Hadean, the Archean, and the Proterozoic, are almost entirely a story of microbes, of chemistry, of the invisible and the small, roughly the first 7/8 of it all, with no animals in it whatsoever. The boundaries of deep time were set down at chemical and atmospheric thresholds, at moments when the world itself changed, not at the debut of anything you could photograph. That is the spine of everything we will walk through tonight, not a ladder climbing upward toward us, a long, slow, mostly invisible unfolding in which we are the very last and briefest flicker. And perhaps right about now, a quiet question is forming somewhere in the back of your sleepy mind, a perfectly reasonable question, the kind a child might ask, and the best kind there is. How does anyone know any of this? How can anyone possibly stand on the earth today and say with a straight face that a particular grey crystal is 4.4 billion years old? How can they look at a layer of rock and declare that it is 2.5 billion years to the year, give or take, since the air began to fill with oxygen? These are staggering claims. How can they be more than guesses? That is exactly where we are going next, and it is one of the most beautiful parts of the whole story, so let it pull you gently forward rather than letting it wake you. Because the answer is not that someone simply decided these numbers. The answer is that deep time can be measured, truly measured. There are clocks built into the rocks themselves, clocks that have been ticking faithfully and unstoppably since the very beginning, and we have learned, slowly and cleverly, how to read them. Those little zircon crystals from the Jack Hills are not only the oldest pieces of the earth we have ever held, they are, each one of them, a kind of clock. A clock running on the steady decay of atoms, ticking off the eons one half-life at a time, indifferent to fire and ice and everything in between. But that is a story for the next quiet stretch of our long night. For now, simply rest in the shape we have laid down. A single day, 24 slow hours, an empty morning, a long bright stretch of nothing but the very small, and the whole crowded, visible, breathing world we know crammed into the final hour, with our own kind appearing only in the last minute, and all our history in the last breath before midnight. 4 eon. Fire, then the first faint life, then the long invisible middle, then at last the age of things you can see, the diary of the earth, kept in stone, waiting all this time to be read. So let the numbers go soft now. Let them blur at the edges the way distant lights blur when your eyes begin to close. You do not need to hold them. They will keep. The story will still be here, ticking quietly along, whether you stay awake to follow it or slip away somewhere in the long morning of the world. And here is where it helps to begin at the very beginning, with the simplest version of the picture, the one you can carry into sleep without effort. Imagine that the whole history of the Earth, all 4.5 billion years of it, has been pressed gently into a single day. Not a year, not a century, one day, 24 hours, beginning at midnight and ending at midnight, with everything that has ever happened on this planet fitted somewhere inside those hours, like furniture into a room that is exactly the right size. At the very first stroke of midnight, at 0000, the Earth forms. It is not the calm blue world you know. It is a thing of molten rock and falling stone, a young planet being battered into shape, glowing in the dark. And then the hours begin to pass. The first single-celled life does not appear at 1 in the morning, or 2, or 3. It waits. It waits until somewhere around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, in the dark before any dawn, when the first faint living things finally stir in the water. And from that hour, all the way through the long, bright middle of the day, through noon and into the afternoon, the world belongs almost entirely to the very small. To things you could never see, microbes and only microbes for hour after hour after hour. Complex cells, the larger and more intricate kind, do not arrive until the afternoon is well along. Multicellular life, creatures made of many cells working together, do not appear until the evening is nearly here. The great burst of animal life, the moment the seas fill with shelled and swimming and crawling things, does not happen until around 9 o'clock at night, 9 in the evening on a day that began at midnight. Plants creep onto the land at about 10. The dinosaurs rule the late evening and are gone by 20 to midnight. The mammals spread out into the world only in the final 20 minutes. And our own kind, the entire span of the human story, every face that has ever looked up at the stars, appears in roughly the last minute of the day. All of recorded history, every pyramid raised, every word ever written, every war and every lullaby takes up only the final fraction of a second before the clock strikes midnight again. Sit with that for a moment in the soft dark where you are. The placements shift a little depending on who is doing the measuring, and these are round and gentle numbers rather than exact ones. But the shape of it does not change, and the shape is the whole point. Animals only in the last hour or so, ourselves only in the last breath. The truth that the title of this long night promises you, said in a single line, is this: the first 7/8 of life's history had no animals at all. None. No fish, no insects, no birds, no beasts of any kind. Just the small and the patient and the invisible, working away in the water, building the world that all the visible creatures would one day inherit without ever knowing they were given it. Wherever you are tonight, drifting in your bed, I would be glad to know it. If you feel like it, leave a small note of where in the world you are listening from, in whatever quiet country or city the dark has found you. And if you are new here, and you would like more slow stories like this one to carry you down towards sleep, you might gently subscribe before your eyes close. There is no hurry. The night is long, and we are going to take it slowly, the way you would walk through a museum that has no closing time, pausing wherever you like and moving on whenever you are ready. So let us walk back to the beginning of that long day and learn its 4 great chapters by name. For the whole sweep of the Earth's history is divided by the people who study these things into 4 enormous spans of time called eons. 4 and only 4. And what is lovely and a little surprising is that the lines between them were not drawn where the interesting creatures appear. They were drawn at deeper and quieter thresholds, at changes in the rock and the air themselves. The first eon is the Hadean. It runs from the very birth of the Earth, around 4.5 billion years ago, to roughly 4 billion years ago. It takes its name from Hades, the old word for the underworld, because that is very nearly what it was, a world of magma oceans and ceaseless impacts, a surface that could not stay still long enough to harden into anything lasting. And here is the strange and telling thing about the Hadean. It is defined less by what is there than by what is not. There are almost no rocks left from it at all. The young Earth simply did not keep a record of those first chaotic hundreds of millions of years. So the boundary of the Hadean is, in a sense, a boundary of absence, a chapter written mostly in the blank space where the rocks should have been. The second eon is the Archean. It begins around 4 billion years ago and stretches to about 2.5 billion years ago. And the Archean begins precisely where the continuous record of rock begins, where the Earth finally settles enough to start keeping a diary that has survived to this day. This is the eon of first life, the eon in which those earliest single-celled things take hold and begin, ever so slowly, to change the planet they live on. The line between the Hadean and the Archean is the line between a world that kept no record and a world that did. The third eon is the Proterozoic, a name that means something close to earlier life. It runs from about 2.5 billion years ago all the way down to 539 million years ago, and it is the longest eon of them all, covering very nearly half of the entire history of the Earth. Half. And yet it is the part of the story that almost everyone skips, the long, invisible middle of our single day, the bright, empty stretch from morning into afternoon. Its beginning is marked by the slow arrival of oxygen into the air and water, and its ending by the first appearance of complex animals large enough to leave a clear mark. Oxygen at the gate, animals at the far door, and between them an unimaginable expanse of time in which the small things quietly remade the world. And the fourth eon, the one we ourselves live inside, is the Phanerozoic. The name means visible life, and that is exactly what defines it. Its boundary was drawn at the moment the rock record suddenly fills with creatures you could actually see, abundant and hard-bodied and shelled, fossils large enough to hold in your hand. The Phanerozoic begins 539 million years ago and runs right up to this very night. And here is the humbling part. Every dinosaur you have ever heard named, every fish, every flower, every animal in every museum hall on Earth belongs to this single, most recent eon, to the last chapter only. 3 of the 4 eons are almost entirely the story of microbes, and only in the 4th does the visible world we think of as life finally arrive. So when those first oldest mineral grains were lifted from the Jack Hills of Western Australia, the zircon crystals dated to around 4.4 billion years. They were reaching back into the deep Hadean dark, into the eon that left almost nothing behind. And what those tiny crystals seem to whisper, against all expectation, is that there may already have been liquid water on the young and burning Earth far earlier than anyone had dared to suppose. But before we can walk any further into this story, before we can trust any of the numbers that will anchor everything that follows, we have to pause and ask the question that any careful mind ought to ask. How do they know? How can anyone look at a piece of rock or a fragment of crystal and say with confidence that it is 4 billion years old or 2 billion or 500 million? The dates seem impossibly certain for something so impossibly ancient, and yet they are not guesses and they are not assumptions handed down from authority. They are measurements, real, physical measurements of atoms doing something that atoms have always done on a schedule so reliable that it makes the finest mechanical clock on Earth look like a rough approximation. The principle behind the deepest of those measurements is called radiometric dating, and it rests on one of the most reassuring facts in all of physics. Certain atoms are unstable. They carry a little too much in their nuclei, and over time they shed that excess and transform into a different element entirely. This process is called radioactive decay, and its most important property, the one that makes it useful as a clock, is that it happens at a rate which nothing in the ordinary world can alter. You cannot speed it up by heating the rock. You cannot slow it down by putting it under pressure. It does not care whether it sits in the cold dark of the deep ocean floor or in the blazing heart of a desert canyon. The rate is fixed, written into the physics of the atom itself, and it has been the same since the atom first formed. The rate is expressed as a half-life. Think of it this way. Imagine you have a jar containing 1,000 unstable atoms of a particular kind. After one half-life has passed, exactly half of them, 500, will have decayed into the daughter element. After another half-life, half of those remaining 500 will decay, leaving 250. After another 125, the number keeps halving on a perfectly reliable schedule, never rushing, never resting, quarter by quarter, of the original. If you know the half-life and you can measure how much of the parent element remains compared to how much daughter element has accumulated, you can calculate how long the clock has been running. You can work out how long it has been since those atoms were sealed into the rock, and the rock solidified, and the clock began. Now, the genius of this for reading deep time lies in choosing the right clock for the right span of time. There are many radioactive isotopes in nature, each with its own half-life, and the half-life must match the age you are trying to measure. This is where the name that most people associate with radioactive dating, carbon-14, runs into its limit. Carbon-14 is a genuinely wonderful tool. It is produced continuously in the upper atmosphere. It gets taken up by living things. And when an organism dies, it stops incorporating new carbon, and the carbon-14 it contains begins to decay. Its half-life is approximately 5,730 years, which makes it exquisitely sensitive for measuring the recent past. It can tell you when a piece of wood was cut, when an ancient grain was stored, when a piece of linen was woven. It has revolutionized archaeology and our understanding of the last few tens of thousands of years of human history. But 5,730 years as a half-life means that after roughly 10 half-lives, after about 57,000 years, the amount of carbon-14 remaining in a sample is so vanishingly small that the measurement becomes unreliable. By the time you are asking about rocks that formed hundreds of millions or billions of years ago, carbon-14 has been exhausted so completely that there is effectively none left to measure. It is the wrong clock for deep time, in the same way that a kitchen timer set for 60 minutes is the wrong instrument for measuring the age of a building. Useful within its range, useless beyond it. For deep time, you need clocks with much longer half-lives. You need isotopes whose decay is so slow that after billions of years, there is still a measurable ratio of parent to daughter, still something to read. And among those long-lived clocks, the one that has become the master reference for the oldest materials in the solar system is the decay of uranium-238 into lead-206. Its half-life is approximately 4.47 billion years. Let that number settle for a moment. The half-life of this particular transformation, the time it takes for half of any given quantity of uranium-238 to become lead-206, is almost exactly as long as the Earth has been in existence, which means that from the moment the solar system formed and the first minerals crystallized and began incorporating uranium into their structure, the clock started, and it has been running ever since, through the formation of the continents and the oceans and all of life and all of history, at exactly this steady, measured pace. It is an atomic clock almost as old as the Earth itself. To use it, a geologist needs a mineral that incorporates uranium when it forms but excludes lead. Because if any lead were already present when the mineral crystallized, you could not know how much of the lead you later measure came from decay versus how much was simply there at the beginning. The starting conditions of the clock need to be clean. And here is where one particular mineral has proven itself almost miraculous for this purpose. Zircon. A zircon crystal, when it forms from cooling magma, accepts uranium into its crystal structure quite readily. But lead, because of the size and charge of its atoms, is almost entirely rejected. the amount of lead incorporated at the moment of formation is essentially zero, so any lead found inside a zircon crystal today must have come from the decay of uranium inside that crystal since the moment it crystallized. The crystal is a sealed system, a closed vault containing its own clock, and the ratio of uranium to lead within it is a direct readout of how long it has been running. Geologists call this kind of closed system dating the gold standard of geochronology, and zircons have been the primary reason we can reach back as far as we can. Zircons also happen to be extraordinarily durable. They can survive conditions that would obliterate almost any other mineral, surviving the destruction and remelting of the rocks around them, surviving billions of years of geological upheaval, washing out of their parent rock and eventually settling in river sediments hundreds of kilometers away, remaining intact and readable through all of it. Which is precisely why the oldest known terrestrial date comes from a zircon grain, a tiny zircon crystal recovered from the sedimentary beds of the Jack Hills in Western Australia, the same Jack Hills whose pale rock had already appeared earlier in this story, yielded an age of approximately 4.4 billion years. Not 4 billion, not 3.5. 4.4, reaching back almost to the beginning of Earth itself, into the Hadean darkness where almost no other record survives. And because that zircon rejected lead when it formed, and because we can measure the uranium and lead it now contains, that age is not a story, it is a measurement. There are other long-lived clocks beside uranium-lead. Potassium-40 decays to argon-40 with a half-life of about 1.25 billion years, which makes potassium-argon dating particularly useful for volcanic rocks across the middle and later ranges of deep time. Rubidium-87 decays to strontium-87 over an even longer half-life, useful for very old crustal rocks. Each clock has its particular mineral hosts, its particular strengths, its particular limitations, and geologists choose among them depending on the material available and the age range being investigated. No single clock is used alone. They are cross-checked, compared, and confirmed against each other, and it is the agreement among independent methods that gives the timescale its authority. But radiometric dating, powerful as it is not the only tool, and in many parts of the geological record, datable volcanic rock simply is not present. You cannot always find a zircon, you cannot always find a volcanic ash layer conveniently sandwiching the rocks you care about. And yet the history of life was being read long before anyone had a reliable radiometric date for anything. Long before the physics of radioactive decay was even understood, scientists were working out the relative order of events, establishing which came before which, building up a sequence of the history of life that turned out, when absolute dates finally arrived, to be essentially correct. They accomplished this through a set of principles so elegant and so simple that they are still the foundation of stratigraphy today. The first and oldest of those principles was articulated by a Danish scientist named Nicholas Steno, who was working in Italy in the 1600s. Steno was a careful observer of rocks and fossils, and he recognized something that, once stated, seems obvious, but that needed to be stated explicitly before it could be used systematically. In undisturbed layers of rock, the older layers lie beneath the younger ones. Sediment settles from above. Material accumulates on top of what was already there. Therefore, in a sequence of undisturbed strata, you can read time upward, layer by layer, the way you might read pages in a book. This is the principle of superposition, and it is the first rule of reading rock. Steno added a second insight alongside it. He observed that any feature that cuts through a layer of rock must be younger than the rock it cuts. If a vein of minerals runs through a bed of sediment, the sediment had to exist first for the vein to intrude into it. If a fault displaces a layer, the layer had to form before the fault displaced it. These cross-cutting relationships, as they came to be called, allowed geologists to establish the relative ages of different features even when no other dating tool was available. With these principles in hand, geologists could read sequences. They could say, this layer came before this one and this feature is younger than that one, but they still could not say how old anything was in years. They could establish order without establishing duration. And the sequence of fossils within those ordered layers began to emerge as another, richer record. As more and more rock was examined across different regions and countries, a remarkable pattern became clear. The same species appeared in the same relative order wherever they were found. Certain creatures appeared only in older rocks and certain others only in younger ones, and the succession was consistent globally. This is the principle of faunal succession, and it was worked out systematically in the early decades of the 1800s by a man who was not, by any formal measure, a trained scientist. William Smith was a canal surveyor in England, a practical man employed in the booming business of building the waterways that fed the early industrial revolution. But as he dug through the English countryside, cutting through layer after layer of rock, he noticed the fossils and he noticed their order. He began to realize that the same sequence of fossil types appeared in the same order everywhere he looked. He published what is often considered the first true geological map in 1815, a map of the rock formations beneath England and Wales, color-coded by their strata. And the key insight underlying the whole thing was that fossil species appear and vanish in a consistent global order. Once you knew what fossil you were looking at, you knew, roughly, where in the sequence you were. You could identify the time from which a rock layer came simply by the creatures it contained, the way you might identify the era of a photograph from the clothes the people are wearing. The fossils most useful for this purpose came to be called index fossils. An index fossil belongs to a species that lived for only a relatively short interval of geological time, long enough to spread across the world, but short enough that finding one pins a rock layer to a well-defined window in the past. Trilobites, which will appear later in this story, as the glamorous early arthropods of the ancient seas, were particularly useful for the earlier parts of the Phanerozoic. Certain ammonites, with their beautiful coiled shells, were extraordinary index fossils for later periods. Even certain kinds of microscopic fossil organisms, invisible to the naked eye but preserving in fine sediments, serve as index fossils of remarkable precision. Finding one in a core of deep-sea sediment tells you exactly when that layer was deposited, within a few million years, which on a geological timescale can be quite precise indeed. What Smith established, without any knowledge of radioactive decay or atomic physics, was a relative timescale, a sequence ordered by fossils, coherent across continents. When radiometric dating arrived in the 20th century, it supplied the absolute numbers, the years, to anchor the sequence. And the remarkable thing was that the two matched. The order that fossils had established was confirmed as correct by the physical measurements. The fossil sequence that Smith had spent decades building from observation was calibrated and vindicated by an entirely independent physical method developed from entirely different principles more than a century later. There is a third method of dating that works on different physical evidence entirely, and it is one of the stranger and more beautiful contributions to our understanding of time. Earth's magnetic field, the invisible force that makes a compass needle point north, has not always pointed north. The field is generated by the movement of molten iron in the Earth's outer core, and that movement is complex and turbulent enough that over long time scales it occasionally reverses. The north and south magnetic poles swap. This has happened hundreds of times in Earth's history on an irregular schedule that is entirely unpredictable in advance, but that, after the fact, can be read from the rocks. When certain minerals cool through a particular temperature, they lock in the direction of the magnetic field as it exists at that moment, like a compass needle frozen in place. Volcanic basalts and certain ocean floor sediments do this reliably. As the rock solidifies, the magnetic minerals within it align with the prevailing field, and that alignment is preserved indefinitely, a permanent record of which way north was pointing when the rock formed. If you drill through a sequence of ocean floor or through a sequence of layered volcanic rocks, you find alternating bands of normal polarity, where the frozen field points the same way our compasses point today, and reversed polarity, where the frozen field points the opposite direction. The pattern of these bands, the thickness of each zone, the sequence of normal and reversed intervals constitutes a unique barcode. No two intervals in Earth's history have had quite the same pattern of reversal timing, and the global master record of those reversals has been built up over decades of measurement from drill cores and ocean surveys. Match your local rock's barcode to the master record, and you know which interval in time it belongs to. This is magnetostratigraphy, and it is particularly powerful in the ocean floor, where new rock is continuously produced at mid-ocean ridges and spreads outward symmetrically. The ocean floor on either side of a ridge is a continuous tape recording of the field reversals, striped like a barcode laid flat, the pattern perfectly symmetrical on both flanks. When the pattern of magnetic stripes on the ocean floor was first mapped in the 1960s, it was one of the key pieces of evidence that confirmed plate tectonics, the theory of moving continents, and it also gave geologists a continuous, readable record of field reversals going back hundreds of millions of years. Each of these three approaches, radiometric dating, the fossil sequence, and the magnetic reversal barcode, works from entirely different physical principles. They draw on entirely different evidence. They were developed at different times by different communities of scientists. And yet they agree, they cross-validate. Radiometric dates calibrate where in the fossil sequence particular layers fall in absolute time. Magnetic reversals fill in the gaps between datable volcanic layers using the same barcode to correlate sediment sequences that may contain no datable minerals at all. Index fossils identify the approximate time of a layer that has neither a volcanic ash bed nor a magnetic reversal record. Where all three overlap, they reinforce each other with a precision that grows finer with every new measurement, every new drill core, every new zircon crystal recovered and analyzed. No single clock stands alone. The authority of deep time does not rest on one method, but on the converging testimony of independent physical facts, each one checked against the others, each one making the whole more reliable. And so when we say that the Archean eon began about 4 billion years ago, we are not repeating a tradition or accepting an authority's word. We are reading a result from instruments cross-checked by other instruments, calibrated against each other over more than a century of careful measurement. The age of the Earth is not a guess, it is a measurement, and it is, by the standards of physical science, a good one. With the machinery of dating in place, we can now begin to read the story the rocks actually tell. And the very first chapter of that story, once you have any rocks at all to read, points to something remarkable. Life appears almost immediately. Almost immediately is, of course, a relative term when you are speaking of geological time. What it means here is that by the time the Archean eon is well underway, by the time there is a continuous rock record to examine at all, the signatures of life are already present. The most ancient, unambiguous chemical signals of biology reach back to at least 3.5 billion years, and there are contested traces that may push that marker back further still, toward 3.7 or even 3.8 billion years. Given that the Earth itself is only 4.54 billion years old, and that the first several hundred million years of its existence was spent in a state of magmatic chaos with no stable crust and the surface being constantly bombarded and remolten, this means that life appears to have arisen with something close to geological speed in the first relatively calm interval the planet allowed. What was that life? Nothing you would recognize, nothing with a face or a structure or any form that would register as creature to your eye or your hand. The earliest life was prokaryotic, which means It consisted of cells without a nucleus, without any of the internal compartmentalization that you carry in your own body's cells. Each cell was a single enclosed chemical system, bounded by a membrane, running the metabolic reactions of life without any of the internal organization that came much, much later. The genetic material floated free within the cell, not enclosed in any separate compartment, not organized the way it is in the cells of every plant, animal, and fungus alive today. Think of a prokaryotic cell as a single room where everything happens at once, a kitchen and a library and a workshop all occupying the same undivided space, with the instructions and the tools and the raw materials all mingling together. This is a perfectly functional arrangement, and it was the only arrangement life used for the first 2 billion years or more. It still dominates life on Earth today if you count by number of individuals and by mass. Bacteria and Archaea, the two great groups of prokaryotes, are everywhere, in the air and the soil and the ocean and the deep rock and inside every living body on the planet. They are not primitive in any meaningful sense. They are extraordinarily successful, extraordinarily diverse, and they underlie the functioning of every ecosystem on Earth. But they are built on the simple plan, the single undivided room, and the first cells on Earth were built this way. What the first cells were eating, energetically speaking, was not oxygen. There was essentially no free oxygen in the early atmosphere. The air of the Archean world, if you could have breathed it, would have killed you within minutes, not because it was thin or cold, but because it was chemically reducing a mixture of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, methane, and traces of other gases with oxygen conspicuously, fatally absent. The early metabolisms ran on other chemistry, on hydrogen sulfide and iron compounds, and reactions that extract energy from geological gradients rather than from the atmospheric oxygen we depend on. Some of the most ancient lineages of life still run these chemistries today in hot springs and deep-sea hydrothermal vents, ecosystems that owe nothing to sunlight or to oxygen and that may be the closest living relatives of the conditions in which life began. The candidate location most often proposed for the origin of life, Luca's birthplace, is a hydrothermal system. Luca is an acronym short for Last Universal Common Ancestor, and it refers to the inferred organism, or more precisely, the inferred population of organisms from which all living things on Earth descend. Every bacterium, every archeon, every plant, every animal, every fungus, every alga on the planet is the descendant of this common ancestor. Luca is not the first cell in the sense that there must have been simpler chemical systems before it, but it is the deepest common node in the tree of life, the point before which all lineages that survived converge. And Luca already had a genetic code. It already used DNA to store information and proteins to carry out chemistry. The deepest machinery of life, the genetic code shared by every organism on Earth, was already in place by the time Luca existed, more than 3.5 billion years ago. Where exactly Luca lived is a question still being explored, but the evidence increasingly points towards something resembling the alkaline hydrothermal vents found on the ocean floor, structures that create natural chemical gradients between the warm, mineral-rich fluid rising from the Earth and the cooler, more acidic ocean water around them. These gradients across the thin mineral walls of the vent structures bear a striking resemblance to the gradient that every living cell today uses to generate energy, the same basic arrangement writ in stone, which suggests that life may have begun by harnessing a geological process that was already occurring, plugging into the planet's chemistry before it had yet invented its own portable version of the same trick. For hundreds of millions of years, the Archean world was populated by these invisible architects, prokaryotes living in the ocean, metabolizing, reproducing, dying, with no witness and no record save the chemical traces they left in the rock, and occasionally something more substantial, something you could, if you found it, actually see. Stromatolites. The word comes from the Greek for mattress and stone, and that combination of softness and hardness captures something of what they are. A stromatolite forms when a mat of photosynthetic microbes, typically cyanobacteria or their ancestors, grows on a shallow seafloor and traps sediment. The microbial mat secretes minerals, binds grains, builds up a thin layer. Then the mat grows upward, away from the sediment it has been buried under, and builds another layer on top. Over time, this process of upward growth and sediment trapping builds up a layered, domed or columnar structure, sometimes reaching heights of several tens of centimeters, occasionally taller, looking faintly like a rounded loaf of stone with visible internal laminations, like the growth rings of a tree but made of alternating mineral and microbial layers. Stromatolites are among the oldest direct fossils of life on Earth. The structures preserved in the ancient rocks of the Pilbara region of Western Australia, some of the oldest sedimentary rocks known, show features consistent with microbial mat construction at roughly 3.5 billion years ago. Whether every ancient stromatolite-like structure was truly biological, whether some might have been formed by purely chemical processes without microbes, is a question that researchers debate with care, because the stakes of misidentification are high and the evidence is faint. But the oldest unambiguously biological-looking stromatolites reach back to close to that number, and by the time the Archean is drawing toward its end, the evidence for microbial mat communities is robust across multiple lines of evidence: chemical, isotopic, and morphological. And then there is the remarkable fact that stromatolites never entirely went away. They are still forming today. In one of the more quietly astonishing places on Earth, a shallow, hypersaline lagoon on the coast of Western Australia called Shark Bay, stromatolites grow in the shallow water, building their layered columns in the sun, just as their ancestors were doing 3.5 billion years ago. The reason they survive in Shark Bay, and in a handful of other similarly extreme places, is precisely because the water is too salty for the snails and other grazers that would otherwise consume them. In the normal ocean, animals long since evolved the habit of eating microbial mats, which is one of the reasons stromatolites became rare in the Phanerozoic after so long dominating the earlier world. Shark Bay, by virtue of its inhospitability to grazers, has preserved a pocket of the Archean world, living and growing in the Australian afternoon sun. You can stand at the edge of that lagoon and look at structures being built by the same basic process that produced the oldest fossils we know, the same quiet, unhurried layering, the same partnership of microbe and mineral, the same patient construction of stone from life. The Archean eons stretched on. The ocean filled with microbial life. The rock record began to accumulate, layer by layer, in the ancient marine basins. Life diversified within its microscopic bounds, finding every available chemical gradient to exploit, refining its machinery, evolving more efficient ways to capture and transform energy. And the world remained, by our modern standards, deeply alien. The sky above those early oceans would have been a murky reddish-orange, filtered through an atmosphere in which methane played a role that carbon dioxide and oxygen play today. The sun itself was fainter, about 70 to 80% of its current brightness, though the composition of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere prevented the ocean from freezing. The continents, what there was of them, were probably smaller and lower-lying than today's, scattered across a world more thoroughly ocean-covered than the one we know. And in every direction, from surface to seafloor, the dominant inhabitants of that world were invisible to the naked eye, living their entire lives in the span of a single cell, conducting the chemistry of life at a scale that made no mark a human could see. This is the part of the story that gets skipped in almost every popular account, the long, quiet billions that preceded everything recognizable, and yet those billions were not empty. They were full of life, full of metabolism, full of evolution, full of the slow accumulation of changes that would eventually make everything else possible. The microbial world was not a waiting room for the Cambrian explosion. It was the main event for most of Earth's history, and the transitions that occurred within it were more consequential for the long-term shape of life than anything that happened after animals arrived. The next of those transitions, the one that would quite literally change the air, was still coming, but it was already being prepared in the chemistry of tiny cells floating in an ancient ocean, on a schedule and in a darkness that no eye had yet evolved to witness. The Archean deepened and turned, its billions of years unfolding slowly, and the microbial world went on building itself in the dark water, refining its chemistry, perfecting the invisible machinery that would eventually tip the whole planet into something new. It is easy, when you are lying quietly and the world outside is still, to imagine the sheer weight of that time. Not the drama of it, not the catastrophe or the rupture, but the depth of it. The patient accumulation of uncounted generations of cells, each one living its brief chemical life and passing its instructions to the next, each one a tiny loop of the same fundamental process, repeated across spans of time so large that the number itself loses meaning and only the feeling of it remains. The quiet patience of the microbial world is not a lesser story because it lacks spectacle. It is, by any honest measure, the longer and more foundational one, the deep root from which everything else eventually grew. And what came next was not an explosion, not a rupture, not anything a creature with eyes could have witnessed because there were no eyes to witness it. What came next was a change in the air, or rather, a change that would, over the span of hundreds of millions of years, produce the air. The air you are breathing now, this particular mixture of nitrogen and oxygen and trace gases that fills your lungs with every slow breath as you lie here, did not always exist. For most of the Archean, the atmosphere was something that would kill you in minutes. And the thing that changed it was not a volcano or an asteroid or a geological upheaval, though those played their parts. The thing that changed it was a microbe, a tiny, single-celled organism that discovered in the chemistry of sunlight and water and dissolved carbon dioxide a way to do something no cell before it had ever quite managed. It discovered how to produce oxygen. The organism is called a cyanobacterium. The name comes from a Greek word for blue-green, which describes the color that the photosynthetic pigments inside it can give to water and rock, and the crusts of microbial mats that carpet the shallow floors of ancient seas. Cyanobacteria are still here, still doing the same thing they have always done, growing in ponds and rivers and oceans, and on the surfaces of soils in almost every environment on the planet. They are, in the scale of things, one of the most successful forms of life that has ever existed. And around 2.4 billion years ago, they began to do something to the planet that took hundreds of millions of years to fully unfold, but that, once started, could not be stopped. They began to fill the oceans with oxygen. The chemistry of what they were doing was, in the abstract, elegant. They were splitting water molecules using the energy of sunlight, releasing oxygen as a byproduct in the same way that a factory releases exhaust, not because the oxygen was wanted, but because it was left over from the process that was wanted, which was the capture of carbon from carbon dioxide to build the molecules of life. The oxygen was, from the cyanobacterium's point of view, waste. It was the thing left over after the useful parts had been extracted, expelled into the water, and from there into the atmosphere with no particular intent or design. It was, in that sense, the oldest and most consequential form of pollution in the history of the planet, and it was catastrophic. For the life that existed in the Archean Ocean before cyanobacteria began producing oxygen in significant quantities, oxygen was not a breath of fresh air, it was a poison. The anaerobic microbes that had spent billions of years developing their chemistry in an oxygen-free world had no defenses against it, no enzymes to neutralize it, no cellular machinery to handle its reactive and damaging properties. When oxygen began to accumulate, first in the oceans, and then, after the oceans had become saturated and could absorb no more, in the atmosphere, it was as though someone had flooded the world with a substance lethal to most of its inhabitants. Entire lineages of organisms that had flourished for billions of years were driven back into the airless corners of the planet, into deep sediments and hydrothermal vents and the airless muds of lake bottoms, where they still survive today, ancient refugees from a world that was remade without their consent. This event, the accumulation of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere beginning around 2.4 billion years ago, is called the Great Oxidation Event, and the evidence for it is written directly into the rock in a way that is both beautiful and precise. Across many parts of the world, in formations in Australia and Canada and South Africa and elsewhere, there are ancient rock sequences called banded iron formations. They look at a distance like enormous striped flags folded into the earth, layers of red and grey alternating over and over, sometimes for hundreds of meters, sometimes stretching for hundreds of kilometers. What those stripes record is exactly the process of oxygen filling the oceans. The red bands are iron oxide, rust, which forms when dissolved iron meets oxygen and precipitates out of solution. The grey bands are iron compounds that formed in the absence of oxygen. The alternation between them, repeated over and over through the sequence, is a record of the chemistry of the ancient oceans swinging back and forth as oxygen levels fluctuated, and then the record changes and the iron oxide dominates, and the ancient sea has filled with oxygen, and the dissolved iron is gone, exhausted, precipitated to the bottom. The banded iron formations are not just beautiful rocks, they are a photograph, taken in chemistry, of the world changing. The Great Oxidation Event is the most important thing that ever happened to life on this planet, and it was a catastrophe first. The poisoning of the anaerobic world, the mass extinction of organisms that had no defense against oxygen, was real and large and effectively unwitnessed because nothing with eyes existed yet to witness it. There was no one to mourn the organisms that vanished. There was no record of them except in the chemistry of ancient sediments and the few survivors driven into the margins. The great dying that ended the Permian, the one we will come to later, the one that killed more than 90% of marine species, the one that comes with a name that captures something of the catastrophe's scale, was devastating. But the Great Oxidation Event was older and in some ways larger, a fundamental rewriting of the conditions for life on Earth, accomplished not by an asteroid or a supervolcano, but by the exhaled waste of a single kind of microbe, accumulating, drop by drop, over hundreds of millions of years, and then it became the precondition for everything. Because oxygen, once it filled the atmosphere, was not just a poison for the organisms it displaced, it was an extraordinary gift for the organisms that could use it. Oxygen is reactive, which is what made it poisonous, but that same reactivity makes it an astonishingly efficient fuel for chemical reactions. Burning something in oxygen releases far more energy than the same reaction in its absence, and cells that developed the machinery to use oxygen in their metabolism, rather than being killed by it, gained access to an energy surplus that the anaerobic world had never known. The door that the cyanobacteria opened, in poisoning most of what came before them, was a door toward forms of life that required more energy than anything that had previously existed. Forms of life that could afford to be bigger, more complex, more organized. Forms of life that would eventually become us. But that was still a long way off, and the next step toward it was not the evolution of a new kind of metabolism. It was something stranger. It was a merger. Somewhere between about 2 billion and 1.5 billion years ago, something happened inside the ocean that was, from the outside, completely invisible. A cell swallowed another cell. This was not unusual. Cells had been engulfing other cells since the earliest days of life, digesting them, using them for nutrients. What made this event different was that the cell that was engulfed did not get digested. For whatever reason, perhaps because it had some defense, perhaps because of some accident of biochemistry, it survived. It stayed inside the larger cell intact, and instead of dying, it went on living, dividing when the outer cell divided, passing itself on to daughter cells, becoming over time not a prey item, but a permanent resident, an internal tenant that had moved in and never left. The resident was a bacterium, a very particular kind of bacterium, one that had evolved the machinery to use oxygen efficiently, to extract large amounts of energy from organic molecules using the oxygen in the environment around it. Inside its new home, in the cellular interior of a larger cell, it went on doing exactly what it had always done. It processed oxygen. It produced energy. But now it produced that energy for its host, or at least the host began to benefit from it, began to depend on it, began to incorporate the energy the resident produced into its own metabolism, until the distinction between host and resident became difficult to draw. The two cells became, over millions of years, one thing. That resident bacterium is the mitochondrion. You have them. Every eukaryotic cell in your body, every cell that makes up your skin and your blood, and the tissue of your lungs and the neurons firing in your brain as you drift towards sleep. Each one contains mitochondria, dozens or hundreds of them working constantly, extracting energy from the food you have eaten and delivering it in a form the rest of the cell can use. They are the power plants of the cell, and they are the descendants of a free-living bacterium that was captured accidentally and without design somewhere around 2 billion years ago by a cell that did not fully digest it. And here is the thing that still carries a small shock of recognition when you understand it clearly. The mitochondria in your cells still have their own DNA, not the DNA in your cell's nucleus, not the genome you inherited from your parents, but a separate, smaller ring of genetic information carried inside the mitochondria themselves, distinct and different, a remnant of the independent organism the mitochondrian's ancestors once were. When scientists first discovered that mitochondria had their own DNA, some of them dismissed it as a curiosity, an anomaly, something that could be explained away. It was a biologist named Lynn Margulis who looked at the evidence and insisted on its meaning. She proposed in the 1960s that the mitochondrion had originated as an independent bacterium, engulfed and then retained through a process she called endosymbiosis, the living together of two organisms inside one another, the building of something new from the conjunction of two formerly separate things. The idea was considered outlandish. It was rejected by journal after journal. Margulis, by her own account, had the paper turned down by about 15 scientific journals before it was finally accepted. The biological establishment was not ready to believe that something as fundamental as the basic unit of complex life had arisen from what was essentially an accident of digestion. They were wrong, and she was right. The evidence accumulated from the DNA of mitochondria, from the comparison of mitochondrial genomes with those of living proteobacteria, from the proteins and membranes and biochemistry of the organelle itself, and it became impossible to deny. Endosymbiosis was real. The mitochondrion was a captured bacterium, and the chloroplast in plant cells, the organelle that performs photosynthesis in every green leaf and blade of grass and alga floating in a sunlit pool, had arisen the same way from a second, separate capture, this time of a cyanobacterium, the same lineage that had filled the ancient ocean with oxygen and thereby made the whole arrangement eventually possible. The plant that leans toward your window, if you have one, is a cell whose ancestors swallowed two separate bacteria and kept both of them, one for energy and one for light. You and the plant beside you are both walking monuments to that ancient series of accidents. The cell that emerged from the first endosymbiotic event, The one that kept the mitochondrion and was changed by keeping it was the eukaryotic cell. Eukaryote comes from Greek words meaning true and kernel, a reference to the nucleus, the membrane-bound compartment that holds the cell's DNA separate from the rest of the cellular interior, a feature that distinguishes eukaryotic cells from the prokaryotic cells of bacteria and archaea. But the nucleus is not the eukaryotic cell's most important innovation. The mitochondrion is, because the mitochondrion provided a level of energy production that had never before existed inside a single cell, and that energy surplus was what made everything subsequent possible. It is not a coincidence that all large, complex, visible life is eukaryotic. Building a body out of many specialized cells, running a nervous system, producing hard shells and moving limbs and complex organs, all of it requires more energy than the older anaerobic metabolisms could provide. The mitochondrion was the upgrade that made complexity affordable. Think of it this way. Before endosymbiosis, the largest and most complex things alive were the microbial mats, layers of different kinds of bacteria living in close proximity, cooperating in loose chemical networks, forming the stromatolites whose shapes we can still find in ancient rock. They were communities, not organisms. Individual cells were small, their energy budgets were tight, and the room for structural complexity was limited. The eukaryotic cell was different in the way that a building with its own electrical generator is different from one that depends on candlelight. The same space, the same basic architecture, but suddenly the capacity to power things that candlelight could not sustain. An engine, a refrigeration system, lighting on every floor. The mitochondrion was the generator, and the eukaryotic cell was the building that could finally be electrified. And with that capacity came, slowly, over many hundreds of millions of years, the next transition. Cells that could afford complexity began to experiment with cooperation. Individual eukaryotic cells began in multiple separate lineages across the history of life to aggregate, to stick together after division rather than floating apart, to share resources, to specialize, so that one cell in a cluster might become dedicated to reproduction, while another became dedicated to feeding the cluster, while another became dedicated to anchoring it to a surface. This is multicellularity, and it did not happen once. It happened many times in many different groups because the selective pressures that favor it, the advantages of size and specialization and division of labor, are general ones that apply across many different kinds of cells in many different environments. The first experiments in multicellularity produced things that do not look like anything alive today. In the period of time that geologists call the Ediacaran, which runs from about 635 million years ago to the boundary of the Cambrian around 539 million years ago, something new began to appear in the fossil record. Not the trace fossils of microbial mats, not the chemical signatures of single cells, but the impressions of larger, soft-bodied organisms, shapes, pressed into the sediment with enough structure to suggest genuine complexity. The Ediacaran organisms are some of the strangest things in the entire fossil record, and part of what makes them strange is that it is genuinely difficult to tell what they were. There are discs that might be anchors for frond-like bodies that extended up into the water. There are quilted mattress-like forms, there are branching fern-like shapes. There are things that look something like a leaf and something like a carpet and something like nothing at all in the modern world. The Ediacaran biota, as these organisms are collectively called, represent what some paleontologists have described as a lost experiment in body design. The rules that governed the shapes of living things in the Ediacaran appear to have been different from the rules that govern them now. Some of these organisms may have been animals in the sense that they were eukaryotic and multicellular and heterotrophic, consuming organic matter rather than producing it through photosynthesis. Others may have been something else entirely, forms of life that belonged to lineages which left no descendants, branches of the tree of life that grew for tens of millions of years and then ended leaving behind only their impressions in the rock. By the close of the Ediacaran, most of them had vanished. The world they had built, strange and soft and slow as it was, came to an end, and what followed them was something that changed the fossil record so dramatically that it marks the boundary of an entire eon. What followed was the Cambrian explosion. The word explosion is, in geological terms, relative. It describes an interval of roughly 20 million years from about 539 million years ago to about 520 million years ago, during which something unprecedented happened in the history of life. In that interval, nearly all of the major animal body plans that exist on Earth today appeared in the fossil record. Not gradually, not in a slow succession of one form giving rise to another over hundreds of millions of years, but in a burst, a geological instant, a flowering of forms so rapid and so diverse that it transformed the record almost overnight by the standards of deep time. Before the Cambrian boundary, the fossil record is largely empty of hard-bodied, structurally complex animals. After it, the oceans are full of them. This is the event that opens the Phanerozoic eon, and it is the reason the Phanerozoic has the name it does. Phanerozoic means visible life, a name that distinguishes this eon from the three that preceded it by the simple criterion that in the Phanerozoic, for the first time, life left a continuous, abundant, hard-bodied fossil record, the kind of record that fills museum display cases and that most people, when they think of fossils, imagine. Everything before the Cambrian was real, was vital, was in many ways more consequential for the long arc of life than anything that followed, but it was largely invisible, small and soft, and leaving little behind. The Cambrian explosion filled the rock with creatures large enough to see. What drove it? There are several hypotheses, and they are probably not mutually exclusive. Rising oxygen levels in the atmosphere and the oceans may have finally reached the threshold needed to fuel the metabolism of large, active, muscular animals. A series of climatic upheavals in the Proterozoic, including episodes of extreme glaciation sometimes called snowball Earth, may have repeatedly stressed and then released ecosystems in ways that accelerated evolution. The evolution of predation itself, the arrival of the first animals that hunted and ate other animals, may have driven an arms race that rapidly selected for hard shells, complex eyes, mobility, and every other feature that made the Cambrian animals so varied and so suddenly armed. When you introduce a predator into a community, the community changes fast. Everything that can be eaten develops a response, and everything that eats develops a counter-response, and the back and forth of that contest can drive the diversification of forms in a geological eye blink. The fossil bed that has given us the most intimate window into the Cambrian world is the Burgess Shale, a deposit in the Canadian Rockies of British Columbia, discovered in 1909. The Burgess Shale is exceptional because the conditions at the site of its formation were unusual in a way that was fortunate for science. In most environments, soft tissues decay long before they can be fossilized, and what the rock preserves is only the hard parts, the shells and bones and teeth. But at the site of the Burgess Shale, organisms that died sank quickly into an environment where decay was inhibited, and their soft bodies were preserved in extraordinary detail. Eyes and guts and limbs and sensory organs, all captured in the fine shale at a resolution that is still astonishing to examine. The creatures preserved there include animals with 5 eyes and a grasping proboscis, animals that filter-fed with elaborate fan-like appendages, animals that look enough like modern arthropods to be recognized as relatives and enough unlike anything alive to be recognizable as representatives of a world that was still working out the possibilities. One of the most remarkable things about the Cambrian explosion is that it represents the moment when complex eyes appear in the fossil record. Eyes are relevant not only because they are impressive in themselves, intricate optical instruments that Darwin famously found difficult to imagine evolving by natural selection, but because their appearance marks a transition in the relationship between organisms and light. Before eyes, light was a chemical signal, a gradient that photosynthetic cells could orient toward, a cue rather than an image. Eyes make the world visible in the full sense of the word, and the appearance of eyes in the Cambrian is arguably the first moment in Earth's history when something on the planet was actually watching. Watching without understanding, without consciousness, in any sense we would recognize, but watching nonetheless, forming images of a world that had existed for 4 billion years without any image of itself. The Burgess Shale also preserves something called picaia, a small ribbon-like creature with a notochord, the flexible rod that is the defining feature of the chordate lineage, the lineage that includes all vertebrates, including you. Picaia is not necessarily the direct ancestor of all vertebrates, but it belongs to the group from which vertebrates eventually descended, a small, soft-bodied creature swimming in the Cambrian Sea, entirely unaware that it belonged to the line that would eventually produce fish and amphibians and reptiles and mammals, and the species that would one day look back at it in a museum. It is a strange thing to contemplate, that small creature in the ancient water and the chain of changes that connected it to you. The Cambrian explosion opened the Phanerozoic and filled the oceans with forms. It was not the beginning of life, not the beginning of complexity, not even the beginning of multicellularity. It was the moment when the long preparation of the Proterozoic, the oxygen and the eukaryotic cell, and the first experiments in multicellular form finally produced creatures large enough and hard-bodied enough to leave a record that fills the rock. The 3 previous eons had laid every piece of the foundation. The Cambrian was the moment when the structure above the foundation finally became visible. And the world that the Cambrian opened was one of extraordinary diversity and competition and change, a world that would continue to surprise and remake itself for the next 500 million years, producing the creatures that fill the later chapters of this story. The seas of the early Phanerozoic were dense with trilobites, those armored, many-legged animals that scuttled across the seafloor and swam in the water column and diversified into thousands of species over hundreds of millions of years before vanishing entirely by the end of the Permian. The trilobites are one of the great success stories of the Phanerozoic, and they are also one of the great examples of how dominance ends, how a group that fills the world for hundreds of millions of years can be reduced to nothing and replaced by something else, and how the replacement feels, in retrospect, inevitable, but was contingent all along on conditions that could have been otherwise. But there is something to pause on here before the story moves into the Phanerozoic's later chapters. Something worth holding in the mind, especially in the quiet of late night, when the ordinary busyness of the world has receded and there is room to feel the scale of what has just been described. The Cambrian explosion, which opened the Phanerozoic and which marks the beginning of everything that most people think of as the history of life on Earth, happened at 539 million years ago. On the 24-hour clock of Earth's history, 539 million years ago falls at around 9 o'clock in the evening. The Cambrian explosion, the debut of visible animal life, the event that opens the age of trilobites and fish, and eventually dinosaurs and eventually us, happened in the 9th hour of the evening on a day that began at midnight. The 7 preceding hours of that day, from midnight to about 9 in the evening, were the Hadean and the Archean and the Proterozoic, the 3 eons of microbes, of chemistry, of invisible transitions in atmosphere and cell structure that built everything else. Everything in a natural history museum, every dinosaur skeleton, every trilobite, every mounted fish and pinned insect, every claw and shell and vertebra belongs to the final 3 hours of that day. And within those 3 hours, the Cambrian and the great proliferation of fish in the Devonian, and the rise of the first land plants, and the age of the great coal forests and the dinosaurs and the first mammals, all of it occupies the last few hours before midnight, and it is not yet midnight, and the story is still being written. That is the shape of it. That is what the long microbial Proterozoic, the patient accumulation of chemistry and cellular innovation, is actually the context for not a prologue, not a waiting room, the main event by duration, by consequence, by the sheer weight of what it built. And the Cambrian, for all its drama and diversity, is what the main event made possible. So the ocean filled with animals, and the trilobites spread across the seafloor, and the first eyes looked out into the green-lit shallows of the Cambrian Sea, and the world was not done surprising itself. Not even close. The Phanerozoic had opened its long account, and the ledger was only beginning to fill. What the creatures of the Cambrian could not have known, had they been capable of knowing anything, was that the conditions they were born into were not permanent, that the chemistry of the ocean and the atmosphere would change again, that competitors they could not see were already evolving, that the world they were building would be taken apart and rebuilt repeatedly by forces larger than any single species or lineage, that the contingency that had shaped everything before the Cambrian, the chance engulfment of a bacterium, the accidental accumulation of oxygen, the fortuitous survival of a cell that did not digest what it had swallowed, was not finished operating. The Phanerozoic, for all that it is the eon of visible life, is also the eon of mass extinctions, the eon of catastrophic resets, the eon in which the contingency of dominance becomes visible and legible in a way that the microbial world's slow changes could not quite make clear. Because in the Phanerozoic the transitions happen fast enough and leave clear enough records that we can see them. We can see the layers in the rock where the trilobites disappear. We can see the thin band of iridium that marks the day the asteroid hit. We can see the banded formations and the carbon isotope excursions and the patterns in the magnetic record that tell the story of each great change. The Phanerozoic is where the story becomes, for the first time, fully readable. And what it reads over and over across its 539 million years is the same lesson the Proterozoic already contained in its chemistry, the same lesson that the great oxidation event delivered in its poisoning of the anaerobic world. No arrangement is permanent. No dominance lasts. Every chemistry that fills the world will eventually be replaced by another. Every organism that rules its environment will eventually give way to something it could not have predicted, something that found an opening in the structure that dominance itself created. The trilobites would have to learn this, the great marine reptiles would have to learn this, the non-avian dinosaurs would have to learn this, and the story of how they learned it and what replaced them and what those replacements eventually produced is the story that the final part of this long night will carry forward slowly into the deep and careful hours before morning. And so we arrive at the land. It is perhaps the strangest transition in all of Earth's long history, stranger in some ways even than the moment a bacterium was swallowed and kept, because the move onto land required not the intimacy of two cells merging, but the slow, grinding, multi-generational conquest of an environment that had existed for 4 billion years without anything living in it. The continents were bare. Not barren in the way a desert is barren, with its lizards and its scattered grasses and its patient cacti, bare in a way we have almost no living analogy for. Stone and dust and wind, nothing else. No soil in any meaningful sense, because soil requires organisms to make it, and there were no organisms yet to make it. The land before life was a kind of stripped geology, a skeleton without flesh, exposed to ultraviolet radiation that the ocean's depth could shield against, battered by temperature swings that water's thermal mass could absorb. It was, by any reasonable measure, inhospitable, and yet around 470 million years ago plants arrived. They were not the plants you would recognize. There were no trees yet, no grasses, no flowers. The first colonizers were small and low, close cousins of modern mosses and liverworts, organisms that had crept up to the very edge of the water and found, against all expectation, that they could survive. They had several things working for them. They were already capable of photosynthesis, already equipped to turn sunlight and carbon dioxide into sugar. What they needed, and what they slowly evolved, were the structural means to hold water inside themselves rather than being bathed in it. A waxy outer coating, a cuticle that sealed moisture in against the drying air. And they needed anchoring. Roots came later in their full complexity, but even the earliest land plants developed simple structures that gripped the rock and the accumulating mineral dust and held on. What they did to the planet, slowly and without intention, was immense. Living things process rock. They secrete acids, they break mineral surfaces apart at the microscopic level, they pull elements out of stone and incorporate them into their own bodies, and when they die, they leave organic matter behind. The first land plants began doing this to the bare continents of the Ordovician period, and in doing so they began making soil. Thin soil at first, a crust of biological activity on the surface of stone, but soil nonetheless. And soil is a substrate for more life, a medium in which other organisms can take hold. The land was not conquered all at once. It was infiltrated slowly, edge by edge, generation by generation, each generation leaving behind a slightly richer substrate for the next. The arthropods were not far behind. Insects and their relatives, the great arthropod lineage, were already diverse and abundant in the sea. They were compact, encased in that exoskeleton that had proven so successful in the Cambrian oceans, capable of breathing through structures that could be adapted for air. Millipede-like creatures are among the earliest confirmed land arthropods, moving through the thin biological films on the early land surface, feeding on the pioneering plants and the microbial mats. Spiders followed. The land, once it had enough moisture and plant material to support something eating plants, rapidly accumulated the feeders on plants and then the feeders on feeders. The food web assembled itself layer by layer in the new environment, as it always does when a surface becomes viable. But the great moment, the one the fossil record captures with particular vividness, was the arrival of the vertebrates. The vertebrates, animals with backbones, had been in the sea since the early Cambrian and had, over the following hundreds of millions of years, diversified enormously. Fish, jawed and unjawed, had filled the Silurian and Devonian oceans, and some of those fish living in the shallow coastal waters and estuaries of the Devonian period found themselves in an environment that created a very particular kind of pressure. The water was warm and sometimes stagnant, the oxygen in it variable, and the land just at the edge was full of food that nothing with fins could yet reach. Around 375 million years ago, there was an animal called Tiktaalik. It was discovered in the Canadian Arctic in rocks of the late Devonian period, and it is one of the most celebrated fossils in the entire record because of what it is caught doing in the frozen moment of its preservation. Tiktaalik was a fish. It had scales, gills, the basic architecture of a fish body, but it had a neck, the first vertebrate known to have one, a neck that let the head swivel independently of the body, that let it look around in a way a fish cannot. Its fins were not quite fins. They were structured internally like limbs with the beginnings of a wrist, with bones that could bear weight. It could almost certainly prop itself up on its pectoral structures and push against the ground. It was not yet walking, but it was on the edge of walking, caught in a body that was negotiating the transition between two worlds, carrying the aquatic inheritance of hundreds of millions of years, while beginning to sketch the plan of the terrestrial body plan that all four-limbed vertebrates, all tetrapods, the word simply means 4 feet, would eventually build upon. Tiktaalik is not an ancestor you can point to and say, this one, directly, gave rise to frogs and lizards and birds and you. Evolution does not work so cleanly, but it is a window into the moment, a snapshot of the kind of animal that was making the transition, and what it shows is that the transition was gradual, incremental, a long series of small changes accumulating in a direction that was shaped, as always, by the pressures of the immediate environment rather than by any plan for the future. The tetrapod body did not arise because something was aiming at land. It arose because certain fish in certain conditions survived slightly better when they could prop themselves up and breathe air, and those slightly better surviving fish left slightly more descendants, and over millions of generations, the margin compounded into something that could walk. By around 360 million years ago, the first true tetrapods, animals with 4 distinct limbs, were moving through the shallow swamps and marshy margins of the late Devonian. The land had its vertebrates now, and from that founding population, over the hundreds of millions of years that followed, would come every amphibian, every reptile, every bird, every mammal, everything with 4 limbs or a body plan derived from one. Your own body, with its particular arrangement of bones, 2 bones in the lower arm, 5 fingers, the basic scaffold of the human frame, carries the deep signature of that Devonian transition, the ghost of limbs that were once fins. The Carboniferous period which followed was a world of extraordinary biological productivity. The land now had forests, not the forests of today, but vast swamps of giant tree ferns and club mosses and horsetails, some of them reaching 30 meters in height, growing in tropical lowlands that spread across much of the land surface that then existed. These forests were so productive and decomposition was apparently so slow, possibly because the fungi and bacteria capable of breaking down lignin, the tough woody material, had not yet fully evolved, that enormous quantities of carbon were buried rather than recycled. That buried carbon is what we call coal. The Carboniferous is named for it. When we burn coal today, we are releasing carbon that was fixed by photosynthesis in those giant Carboniferous swamps, stored for 300 million years in darkness, and now returning to the atmosphere. We are, in a sense, undoing a Carboniferous burial project on a geological timescale, compressed into centuries. The reptiles appeared in the Carboniferous. They solved a problem that the amphibians could not. The amniotic egg, with its own internal membrane and moisture supply, meant that reproduction was no longer tied to standing water. A reptile could lay its eggs on dry land, far from any pond. And with that single innovation, the continents opened fully. Every dry interior, every highland, every desert, environments unreachable by animals that had to return to water to breed, became accessible. Reptiles spread. The Permian period saw them diversify into an enormous range of forms, some of which were the ancestors of what would eventually become mammals. The so-called synapsids, the lineage that would lead, over tens of millions of years, to the first true mammals, were among the dominant animals of the Permian, ranging from small insect eaters to large predators to the strange sail-backed Dimetrodon, which you might have seen in old natural history illustrations, often mistakenly captioned as a dinosaur. It was not a dinosaur, it was actually more closely related to you. And then roughly 252 million years ago, the world ended. The end Permian extinction is the largest mass extinction in the history of complex life. Not the most famous. The one that took the non-avian dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous tends to claim more cultural space, but the most severe. The best estimates suggest that something like 90% or more of all marine species vanished during this event. Life in the oceans came within what feels, looking back, like a terrifyingly slim margin of total erasure. The land suffered too, though perhaps somewhat less catastrophically, but even on land the losses were enormous, and the ecosystems that had developed over hundreds of millions of years were stripped back to their foundations. The driver was the Siberian traps. This name requires a moment. A trap, in geological terminology, is a series of stacked lava flows, one on top of another, the word coming from a Swedish term meaning staircase, because eroded trap formations develop a characteristic stepped appearance on the landscape. The Siberian traps are one of the largest volcanic provinces in Earth's history, a region of what is now Siberia that experienced a sustained eruption of almost inconceivable scale, pouring out lava over an area of roughly 2 million square kilometers, releasing into the atmosphere enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases over what may have been a period of millions of years, though the worst pulse was faster than that. The effects cascaded. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere drove warming. Warming changed ocean circulation and chemistry. The oceans acidified and also developed large dead zones where oxygen became depleted. And the marine life that had evolved in the relatively stable chemistry of the preceding Permian simply could not adapt quickly enough. It died. The sulfur dioxide from the eruptions produced acid rain on the land. The warming, the acid, the chemical disruption, they combined into a set of simultaneous assaults on life support systems that had no single fix because they were hitting from multiple directions at once. Life recovered. It always has in the 4 billion years we can trace. But the recovery from the end Permian extinction took something like 5 to 10 million years, and the world that emerged on the other side was different in its fundamental constitution from the world that had entered. The synapsids, the proto-mammal lineage, were reduced. A group called the Archosaurs, the lineage that would produce both the dinosaurs and the crocodilians, expanded to fill many of the emptied ecological roles. In the shuffling and redistribution of dominance that follows every great extinction, the Archosaurs drew the long card. The dinosaurs appeared in the Triassic period, not long after the end Permian recovery, and by the Jurassic they were the dominant large animals on land. They held that position for somewhere between 150 and 165 million years, depending on how you draw the lines. That is a duration of success so vast that it makes human civilization, in existence for perhaps 12,000 years, recorded in writing for perhaps 5, look like a brief flicker of attention. The dinosaurs filled every large ecological role, from enormous long-necked herbivores browsing the high canopy to bipedal predators with binocular vision and complex social behavior. They had feathers. We know this now from exquisitely preserved specimens, particularly from the Cretaceous of China, and at least some of them may have been warm-blooded in ways we would recognize. They were not the slow, dim, cold-blooded creatures the early paleontologists imagined. They were, by any serious measure, extraordinarily successful, and the mammals were there the whole time. This is perhaps one of the most quietly remarkable facts in the entire story, and it bears dwelling on. The first true mammals appear in the fossil record during the Triassic, around the same time as the first dinosaurs or shortly after. For more than 100 million years, for the entire span of the Jurassic and most of the Cretaceous, mammals existed. They did not disappear. They were not rare in the absolute sense, but they were small. Almost all of them appear to have been small, nocturnal, insectivorous creatures living in the margins of a world that the dinosaurs occupied at every large scale. They scurried, they hid, they came out at night when the large predators were less active, and they ate insects and small prey, and probably anything else they could find. For 100 million years, our ancestors were the creatures in the corners, the ones making a living in the ecological gaps that the dominant forms did not bother to fill. There is something almost meditative about this, if you let yourself sit with it. 100 million years of obscurity, 100 million years of being small and quiet and carefully not getting eaten. The mammals were not, in any sense, that would have been visible to a Cretaceous observer, the next dominant group. They showed no particular sign of greatness. They were good at being small and surviving. That was, for a very long time, enough. Then, roughly 66 million years ago, on a morning that the rock record captures in a layer of material only a centimeter or so thick in many locations around the world, something arrived from space. The asteroid was approximately 10 kilometers across. To put that in terms that the body can feel rather than just the mind process, that is roughly the height of the highest mountain on Earth if you tipped it on its side and set it moving through the atmosphere at a velocity of many kilometers per second. It struck in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico in a shallow sea at a location called Chicxulub, and the energy released was incomprehensible. In ordinary terms, something many orders of magnitude beyond the largest nuclear weapons ever built, delivered in an instant. The impact vaporized rock, sent a plume into the upper atmosphere, triggered fires across much of the northern hemisphere, and, most devastatingly for the creatures that survived the first hours, threw so much material into the stratosphere that sunlight was blocked for months, perhaps years. Photosynthesis crashed, plants died, the food chains that depended on plants collapsed. The large animals which needed to eat a great deal to maintain their large bodies starved. The evidence for this event is not speculative or indirect. It is written in the rock in multiple independent ways, each line of evidence confirming the others. The global iridium layer is perhaps the most famous. Iridium is rare in Earth's crust but relatively more common in asteroids, and at sites all over the world, in Europe, in North America, in the deep-sea sediment cores of the Pacific. There is a thin band of iridium-enriched clay sitting precisely at the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene periods, the same boundary at which the non-avian dinosaurs disappear from the fossil record. And the crater itself, the Chicxulub structure, lies buried beneath the sediments of the Yucatan, detectable by gravity anomalies and drilling. A ring, roughly 150 to 200 kilometers in diameter, the preserved scar of the impact. The non-avian dinosaurs died, but the birds survived. This point deserves to be stated clearly because it is often glossed over in casual tellings of the story. Birds are dinosaurs, not metaphorically, not loosely. They are in the strict cladistic sense in which biologists group animals by their evolutionary relationships, theropod dinosaurs. The dinosaurs did not go extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. One lineage of them survived, a lineage that had already been diversifying for tens of millions of years, characterized by feathers and flight and small body size, and the particular metabolic and physiological features that apparently allowed them to persist through the catastrophe that erased their larger relatives. When you watch a bird at a feeder in the morning or hear one before dawn, you are watching the direct descendant of the animals that survived the Chicxulub impact, the sole surviving lineage of a group that dominated the land for 150 million years. And the mammals, in the emptied world that followed, they radiated. There is a word in evolutionary biology, adaptive radiation, that describes what happens when a group of organisms suddenly finds itself with access to ecological space it could not previously reach, usually because whatever had been occupying that space is now gone. The mammals, released from 100 million years of living in the shadows of the dinosaurs, underwent a radiation of this kind during the Paleogene period, the roughly 30 million years that followed the end Cretaceous extinction. They grew. In the span of geological time that feels almost rapid, mammals filled the large body ecological roles that the dinosaurs had vacated. Hoofed mammals spread across the plains. Whales, descendants of terrestrial mammals that had gone back to the water, appeared in the oceans by around 50 million years ago, their land-living ancestry still visible in their anatomy, in the vestigial hip and leg bones that float unattached inside the bodies of modern whales, elephants, bats, the only flying mammals filling the night insect niche that had been available since insects first flew. Primates, small and tree-dwelling at first, diversifying in the tropical forests of what was then a warmer world. Each of these radiations was a form of filling. Each was a group finding the empty shape left by whatever had been there before, and growing over millions of years to fit it. Dominance, in this light, looks less like achievement and more like opportunity taken, an ecological opening that exists because something else no longer occupies it. And across all of this time the principle holds. The trilobites held the early seas for hundreds of millions of years before disappearing entirely. There are no trilobites anywhere on Earth today, and they had no warning that their tenure was temporary. The Ediacaran creatures, the frond-like and disc-like animals of that strange, soft-bodied experiment, flourished and vanished before the Cambrian, leaving almost nothing that persists to the modern world. The great marine reptiles of the Mesozoic, the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, dominated the oceans through much of the same time the dinosaurs ruled the land, and they are gone too, replaced not by their own descendants, but by other lineages that found their niches vacant. No group's dominance endures, no group's extinction is predicted. The pattern repeats again and again across the record, not as a law, but as a statistical truth. The most successful and established groups have, over geological time, given way to others. It is not a comforting thought exactly, but there is something in it if you let it settle that moves past discomfort into something quieter and stranger. A recognition that permanence was never the deal, that it was never offered to any of the organisms that preceded us, and that our own existence here, right now, is embedded in that same contingency. We are not the end point. We are the current occupants. The genus Homo is somewhere between 2 and 3 million years old. Against the 4.5 billion year span of this story, that is a number so small that fractions become the only honest way to express it. And Homo sapiens, our own species, anatomically modern humans, with the skull shape and brain volume and basic anatomy you would recognize as fully human, has been here for something like 300,000 years. 300,000 years. In a story 4 billion years long. And recorded human civilization and the cities, the writing, the accumulated knowledge of everything anyone has ever thought or discovered or built or burned, all of it, from the first clay tablets to whatever screen or device carries these words now, occupies perhaps 12,000 years at the most generous counting, and perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 if you measure only from the earliest written records. Which brings us back to where we began, back to the clock. If you take all 4.5 billion years of Earth's history and compress them into a single day, a single revolution of the Earth on its own axis, 24 hours, midnight to midnight, then Earth itself forms at the very first stroke of midnight. The Hadean, that hellish eon of magma and impacts, takes up the first 4 to 5 hours of darkness. By the time the first dim light of very early morning begins to suggest itself, the rock record has stabilized and the Archean has begun, and life, the first simple, prokaryotic, anoxic life, the bacterial mats and the ancestors of the stromatolites, is already present, or arrives very shortly. The morning passes. The whole of the morning, several hours of it, belongs entirely to the microbial world. There are no animals. There are no plants, in any sense you would recognize. There is chemistry, and there is the gradual, quiet accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere, the slow poisoning of the anaerobic world, and the slow construction of the world that breathes. The great oxidation event would fall somewhere in the late morning to midday range, and the long afternoon, hours and hours of what would feel, if you were watching the clock, like very little happening, is the Proterozoic, the long, slow development of eukaryotic complexity, of the first cells with nuclei, of the mitochondria, settling into their permanent internal residence of multicellularity, assembling itself for the first time. 9 in the evening. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, by this compression, complex multicellular animal life begins to appear. The Ediacaran creatures are moving slowly through the late evening hours. The Cambrian explosion, that riot of body plans and the first hard shells and eyes, arrives somewhere in the vicinity of 9 o'clock, perhaps a little after. You are now in the final hours of the day. All of the Cambrian, all of the Ordovician, all of the Silurian, all of the Devonian, the whole first chapter of animal life in the sea occupies a span of time that, on the clock, is being measured in the remaining hours before midnight. Plants reach the land around 10 in the evening. The great carboniferous coal forests flourish and are compressed into the dark in the hour that follows. The Permian and its great dying, the Triassic and the rise of the dinosaurs, the Jurassic, all of this plays out in the final 60 to 90 minutes before midnight, the clock moving with a slowness that hides how much is happening. The asteroid hits Chicxulub at roughly 20 minutes before midnight. Perhaps 20 minutes before the end of the day, the age of large non-avian dinosaurs ends. And in the final 20 minutes, in the last scrap of the day, the mammals fill the emptied world. Whales go back to the sea in those 20 minutes. Elephants appear. The primates begin diversifying. The genus, Homo, our genus, arrives in roughly the last minute of the day, the last 60 seconds before midnight. And anatomically, modern Homo sapiens, us, fully human people with our capacities and our questions and our love of stories and our tendency to lie awake thinking about time, appear only in the last few seconds. Not the last minute, the last few seconds. All of recorded human history, every city ever built and abandoned, every war ever fought, every book ever written, every piece of music ever composed, every discovery ever made, every name ever spoken and forgotten, the whole of what we call civilization, the whole of what we call history, fits, in this compression, into something that is not even a full second before midnight, a fraction of a second, a sliver so thin that to represent it honestly on a clock face, you would need a mark smaller than the finest line a human hand could draw. We are, by the measure of deep time, almost impossibly new. And this is the thing that the story of life on Earth offers. If you stay with it long enough, if you let the scale settle into the body rather than just the mind, not despair at the smallness of our moment, but something closer to wonder at the fact of it. 4.5 billion years of chemistry and catastrophe and slow microbial accumulation and sudden extinction and contingent recovery, all of it proceeding without any destination, without any arc that was aimed at anything in particular. And here, in the final seconds of this vast day, a creature developed that could look back at all of it and ask, how did this happen? And how do we know? And what does it mean? The atoms in your body are old. Most of the calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the carbon that forms the backbone of every molecule you are built from, none of it was made here. It was forged in stars that lived and died before the Earth existed, scattered into the gas cloud that collapsed to form our solar system, incorporated into the rock and ocean, and eventually into the chemistry of the first cells, passed from organism to organism across 4 billion years of eating and dying and being eaten, until the specific configuration of atoms that constitutes you came to exist for this brief interval. And inside your cells, in the mitochondria that are powering you even as you rest, there sits the descendant of that ancient engulfed bacterium, still carrying its own small genome, still doing the work it was recruited to do 2 billion years ago. You are not a single thing, you are a collaboration that spans 2 billion years, a kind of biological corporation assembled from a merger so old that neither party remembers it, but the paperwork is still there, written in DNA. The story of life on Earth is not a story of progress toward us. There is no arrow pointing at humanity in the fossil record. The cyanobacteria that changed the atmosphere 2.5 billion years ago were not preparing the world for complex animals. The asteroid that killed the non-avian dinosaurs was not clearing the stage for mammals on purpose. The mammals that scurried in the dark for 100 million years were not patiently waiting for their moment. Everything that happened because the conditions made it possible, and because the organisms present in those conditions varied slightly from one another, and because the variants that matched the conditions slightly better survived slightly more often, and because over millions of generations those slight advantages compounded into the extraordinary diversity of form and function that the record preserves. We are an outcome of this process, not its aim. And that might be the most astonishing thing of all, that a process with no intention produced, eventually, intention. That a universe of chemistry produced, after sufficient time and sufficient complexity, the capacity to be curious about itself. There is a quietness available in this if you let yourself find it. Not the quietness of insignificance, though the scale is undeniable, but the quietness of belonging to something vast and old and genuinely strange. You are part of the story. The atoms that built you were here in the Hadean, in the Archean oceans, in the Proterozoic chemical experiments that eventually produced the eukaryotic cell. The story did not end before you arrived. It continues through you in ways that are no more predictable now than the mammal's dominance was predictable in the shadow of the Jurassic dinosaurs. This is the planet as it actually is, not a backdrop to human history, but a 4.5 billion year story in which human history is the most recent word still being spoken in a very long sentence. The zircon crystals in the Jack Hills of Western Australia have been sitting in their stone for 4 4/10 billion years, patient and closed, and carrying their atomic clocks in silence, waiting for someone to read them. They have now been read. The stromatolites in Shark Bay still rise, still do what their ancestors were doing when the Archean was new, still fixing carbon and releasing oxygen in the same slow biochemical rhythm. The iridium layer still sits in its clay, its thin dark line preserved in rock faces on several continents, marking the day with a chemical exactness that no human witness could have managed better. The Burgess Shale still holds its Cambrian creatures in the Canadian stone, soft bodies preserved by the particular conditions of their burial 500 million years ago, waiting for eyes to find them and minds to wonder. All of this is still here. The evidence does not go away. The record is long and it is readable, and it says, if you listen to it with patience, that life is resilient in ways that the individual scale cannot perceive, that catastrophe is not the end but a kind of reset, that complexity builds on complexity given enough time, and that even in the darkest and most barren moments of Earth's history, something has always found a way to persist. If you have come this far in the night, you have traveled 4.5 billion years. You have been present at the forming of the oceans and the quiet work of the first prokaryotes. You have felt the weight of the great oxidation and the intimacy of the engulfed bacterium making its permanent home inside the first eukaryote. You have walked the edge of the Cambrian Sea at the moment the first eyes opened to find a world suddenly full of other creatures, and you have stood at the margin where Tiktaalik propped itself up on the boundary between water and air. You have felt the darkness of the end Permian and the specific, geologically sudden silence of the day the asteroid arrived, and you have watched the mammals emerge into the open, blinking in a world rearranged for their opportunity. And you have arrived here, now, in the final seconds of the great day, in a body that is itself a library of every one of those transitions, every one of those ancient compromises and mergers and survivals, carrying the chemistry of the Archean and the cellular architecture of the Proterozoic and the tetrapod body plan of the Devonian, shaped by all of it, belonging to all of it, without needing to do anything to earn that belonging. The Earth is quiet now. The long day is nearly done. The atoms are resting in their temporary configurations, doing what atoms do, which is to continue. If you feel moved to share where you are listening from tonight, what country, what city, what small dark room, I would genuinely like to know. The comments are there, and I read them. There are more stories here of the same slow and careful kind, waiting for whenever the night calls for them again. You have done enough for one night. You have held the whole of deep time in your mind, and that is a long, long way to have traveled. Put down whatever remains of the day. Let the Archean settle. Let the Proterozoic go quiet. Let the Phanerozoic, with all its noise and color and catastrophe and renewal, grow still. Let the deep thoughts settle and let yourself sink with them. Good night. Sleep well.